I'd like to start this lecture not by talking about the collections, but about a person who many of you know, and that is John Ayres.
Yes. Yes.
John was my boss when I first went to work at the V&A, and I worked under John for 3 years until he retired. And it was very much a kind of duck and duckling situation. Everywhere that John went, I went. And everything that John looked at, I peered over his shoulder. Because, as you know, when you learn about objects, you need to look at lots of things. And the greatest thing that we can do is to look with a teacher who can teach us about those things. Now, after John retired from the V&A, he went on to do many things, and in due course he was asked to catalogue the royal collections. And he started that job, and it took him 30 years. In the beginning, he attacked it with vigour. As the decades passed, still with great vigour, but perhaps needing a little more help and support, which he received. And in 2016, those 3 volumes of the Royal Collection came out, which many of you will be familiar with, and it was a triumph. So I have been honoured and privileged to work again with John in a very minor way on this great project, and that's what this lecture is about. Now, I should say that I should never start a lecture by lamenting, but I do lament what happened in the early 17th century in England. There was a revolution, and King Charles I was dethroned, and then he was beheaded in 1649 by the parliamentarians headed by Oliver Cromwell. I don't decry the political events, but at that time, England was broke. I mean, it's a recurring thing in our history, but England was really on its uppers. And so the royal collection was sold off to raise money. And in later years, many of the great treasures were bought back. The pictures, for example, if you go to see in the wonderful Queen's Gallery, the Queen's collection of pictures, many of those things were purchased in later times, but I have to say that the Chinese objects, the Chinese porcelains and whatever else there were never repurchased. They weren't considered important in years gone past. And that, to me, is a real pity, because if we think about Queen Elizabeth I in the 16th century, we think about Francis Drake pillaging those Spanish ships, and what must have entered the collections, we're missing a great richness. And in fact, Philippa Glanville has written about extant pieces of Chinese porcelain that we know about from 16th century records, but none from the royal collection. What a shame. So we have to move to the end of the 17th century to Queen Mary II, who was the daughter of another rather foolish Stuart monarch, James II, who was betrothed in her teens to William of Orange, who later became our great King William in Britain. And so, of course, Mary spent her formative early years in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands in the 17th century was the great centre for amassing works of Chinese and Japanese goods from the Far East. Amsterdam and The Hague were the great ports, and all the great goods came in there and were dispersed outwards across Europe. And so Mary's taste was formed in the Netherlands, and when she came to England, as has been much written about, she set up her Chinese collection in Hampton Court Palace. And in southwest London, many of you will have visited. And the great drawings by Daniel Marrow of the way that the ceramics in those days would have been set up on the walls. And I'd just like to say at this point that 2 weeks ago I was in Dresden, as were Brian and Anna and some of you, I think, because I'm part of the great project to catalogue the collections of Augustus the Strong, the Chinese and Japanese porcelains, and it's a wonderful project. But one of the things I learned in Dresden, which shouldn't have surprised me, but it did, was that Augustus's collection, all tens of thousands of pieces of it, range in quality from the extremely high right down to the extremely poor. And Mary's collection, of course, much smaller, but I was somehow expecting a collection of Kangxi porcelain of the late 17th century that was more akin to the collection of George Salting in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which some of you may know about. That was a great collection formed in the 19th century, nearly 10,000 pieces of porcelain, and all of the most superlative quality. So when I was at the V&A, I worked with the Salting collection, and then I went to Dresden, and I thought, goodness me, this is rather different. Of course, it was pointed out to me that many of the lesser pieces would have been mounted in great displays on the wall, and so if they were kind of 15 feet up from you, you didn't notice what the quality was. They were just amassing huge quantities of pieces to make displays on the walls. And this is the underlying decorative notion which underpins Mary's early collections as well. But I don't want so much to talk about that, but really about some exceptional pieces, pieces that are interesting to me in the royal collection. And the first of them is from Mary's collection, this extraordinary brush pot. You can see that it was mounted up in Europe early on, so it definitely came to Europe. But it's very much a Chinese taste piece. It's a brush pot. It's what a Chinese person would put their brushes on when they were doing calligraphy or painting. And it's got this poem on it by the famous poet and great statesman Wang Anshi. Now, Wang Anshi was really a great figure in Chinese history, a noted politician and statesman, but he was also a great poet. By which I mean he didn't just scribble verses, but he really was a thoroughgoing poet, because Chinese officials under the old imperial system were picked from the very finest of the intelligentsia, and they were expected to excel in branches of culture, to be able to do calligraphy, to do painting, to compose poetry, to make music. So they were all-round educated men. And so it's a poem by Wang Anshi on the brush pot here, and it's rather a pretty poem. And you can see that the last two lines, I sat a long while counting the falling blossoms, took time to search for fragrant herbs, and so to return home late. And you can see the scholar on the brush pot here being helped home by his two servants. He's probably had a drink or two as well to help him on his way. So, why should this end up as an export piece? Well, the assemblages on the ships that sailed to the Netherlands in those days were really quite eccentric. We know from pieces that survive. There were, of course, the obvious export pieces, but lots of other things crept in as well. So this must have been part of a cargo. And what about these two little sweeties? These are two wine pots, and they're in the form of deer. And I have to tell you, there's one in Dresden as well, but the one in Dresden, the horns are broken off the head, and it was catalogued as a donkey. So we concluded, no, not a donkey. Look at the ones in the royal collection with the horns, because the deer, of course, in Chinese symbolism, it's a verbal pun. The word for deer is lu, and that means obtaining a good salary. So there's a reason that you would have a wine pot in the shape of a deer. It wish that you earned a lot. But Queen Mary, of course, had none of that information, and it's listed in the inventories because one of the great things about the Royal Collection, I'm not going to show you the inventories as other speakers have done, but all these pieces in the Royal Collection are wonderfully inventoried and catalogued and recorded in a variety of ways. And you can see here in 1697 they were in the old bedchamber 2 little deer of 5 coloured china. So they were in the bedroom as display pieces. And an item of blanc de chine, of dehua. This was one of the most popular styles of Chinese ceramics for export in the 17th century, and huge collections of it were made all over Europe. It wasn't the most numerous kind of export porcelain from the point of view of numbers, but people liked it very much. And here you can see the deity Guan Yin riding on a lion, and in the inventory it says, over the door 2 lions with figures on them. And these, much more unusual actually, much rarer, these are 2 incense burners. Actually, both of them have got lids. The lids are actually the saddles which lift off. I don't know why they were photographed with one with a lid missing, but anyway, they both got lids. And in the form of oxen, but these are Japanese celadons of mid-17th century date. They're very, very rare things, you know. They're extremely nice items. Now, we kind of skip through the whole of the 18th century. I have to say that the English kings, the Georges, were not enormous consumers of Chinese or Japanese porcelain. It doesn't enter into the royal world at all. And I next end up with this political event, which was the mission by George Macartney, who was sent by King George III to China to try and negotiate a trade deal. The idea was that they would set up an embassy in Peking with an ambassador. They would jolly well make the trade situation down in Guangzhou, in Canton, much more straightforward. They actually wanted an island off the coast of South China to trade from. Guess what happened in the next century? So this embassy travelled to China, and it's a wonderful story. It's been chronicled by many authors, and the embassy was accompanied by 2 draftsmen who drew pictures of the whole journey. They travelled to the southeast coast in their great warships. They were conducted with all their official gifts up the Grand Canal to Beijing, where they resided for a while. Then the Emperor Qianlong, who you will have heard of yesterday, the great 18th century emperor, was not actually in Beijing. He'd gone off for the summer north of the Great Wall to the summer palace in the north, where they liked to go hunting, and it was a lot cooler up there, at Rehe, Jehol, it's sometimes. And so the poor old embassy of Macartney had to get on its horses again and travel north through the Great Wall all the way up to Rehe, where they were received by the Qianlong Emperor. And this is a famous occasion where, they refused to kowtow as a mark of the dignity of the English crown. They took with them a great number of gifts, scientific gifts, clocks, all kinds of wonderful things. Many of those are still in the Forbidden City in Beijing. But I have to say that contrary to what Marie-Laure was talking to us about yesterday, about the favourable reception of Sèvres porcelain, there wasn't exactly rapture on the part of the Qianlong Emperor with the British gifts, because in the palace there has been discovered in the course of research a copy of the original inventory of the list of gifts which Qianlong sent back to King George III, and also of a long letter that he sent. And this is very important because there's a copy of the inventory in the letter in Beijing. There was a copy of both in the British Library, and lo and behold, in the Royal Archives, as research was done, the original copies turned up there as well. So it's all very exciting. And I have to say that the letter from Qianlong, dated 1793 to King George III is one of the most exquisitely rude documents I've ever read. Really kind of put him in his place. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just read you a little bit because it's delightful. And it's very well translated here by two English missionaries in the early 20th century, Backhouse and Bland, who really did a good translation. Anyway, part of the letter to George III says, "You, O King, live beyond the confines of many seas. Nevertheless, impelled by your humble desire to partake of the benefits of our civilization, you have dispatched a mission respectfully bearing your memorial. Your envoy has crossed the seas and paid his respects at my court on the anniversary of my birthday." I don't think the British mission was actually aware of that. "To show your devotion, you have also sent offerings of your country's produce. Our dynasty's majestic virtue has penetrated unto every country under heaven, and kings of all nations have offered their costly tribute by land and sea. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures. I, in my turn, have made gifts of which I enclose an inventory." The ultimate put down, but couched in the most wonderful Chinese, so polite. So what did Qianlong send back to George III? Well, actually, he sent some very nice things, including this. This is listed in the official list of goods. This is a great big jardinière or jar, imperial blue and white, with a Qianlong rain mark on it. Now, this is the sort of thing that if it was auctioned here in Christie's, would fetch several £billion, and everyone would be weeping with excitement. And also this wonderful imperial lacquer box. Now, lacquer, of course, was completely unknown to Europe. The use of lacquer, lacquered furniture was imported, but this is top quality imperial carved lacquer of the sort that had never been seen before, and it has the manufacturing description and an imperial rain mark on the bottom. And on the top, this character says springtime, so it's wishing rebirth and renewal. So not bad, the Qianlong gifts. I'm not sure whether George III kind of realised what he was getting, but they're still there. Now, from there we move to King George IV, and a completely different story. George IV, when he was Prince Regent, that great consumer of everything from food to porcelain, he, of course, as Brian was telling us last night, he built his huge palace in London, Carlton House, on the site where the Athenaeum now partially occupies, an enormous overblown building, which I read was so kind of massively constructed that it almost collapsed while it was still standing there. And George IV, while still the Prince Regent and after he became king, liked to furnish his palaces with gorgeous objects. And he bought quite a number of good pieces. These come from a French collection, very much in the taste of Marie Antoinette. In France, there are whole sets of these little turquoise pieces with gilded mounts. And as you can see, that these were delivered to Carlton House between the 1st of July and the 26th of September 1803. And this is actually Japanese lacquer. Isn't it interesting, Anthony? It's an early piece, slightly cut down, and with these wonderful French gilt mounts. Here's a watercolour of the blue velvet room at Carlton House. What can that have been like? Well, I don't know whether you can see over there, there's an object. Well, this is what it is. Of course, at this period, and particularly George IV loved to mount up his porcelains in all kinds of mounts. Some were accompanying the pieces when they came to England, French mounts, for example, or German mounts, but he also got the mounters of London working overtime to mount up pieces. And what's interesting, and it's not unique to England, is that many of the Chinese porcelains inside these elaborate mounts are kind of pretty ho-hum. You know, this vase here, it was probably pretty new when it was mounted up in the late 18th or early 19th century. Oh, there we are. And it's said to have gilt mounts by Vulliamy, who was very busy. There are lots of records of objects being commissioned and coming into the palace, and lots of order forms and all the rest of the paraphernalia that surrounds it. And the other palace, of course, that George IV was patron of was the wonderful Royal Pavilion at Brighton, that Orientalist fantasy. And he liked to furnish that as well with extraordinary objects. But I've picked out these, which are rather humble little things. I guess you thought maybe I was going to show you something covered with ormolu, but these are actually little tea bowls and covers, and they date to the Jiaqing period, which is 1796 to 1820. So these were almost brand new when they came into the palace, and that's quite surprising, really. Whether they were used for tea drinking or whether they were just ornamental, we don't know. And this pair of elephant candle holders, there are two pairs. There are two with red stands and two with green stands here. And I show you these are all selfish things, but I've catalogued a number of these in the past in collections, and I've always called them 19th century. But now we can see that they were already inventoried in the Royal Pavilion, Brighton, in the early 19th century. So that's very, very pleasing. It pushes the date back a little bit. And as with the case with this kind of thing, I was at Masterpiece looking at various things, and this sort of crackle glazed Chinese porcelain with these overglazed, these unglazed but stained with iron brown patterns on the surface. Again, we have pieces like that in the V&A. I often see them in collections. The piece in the V&A was actually inventoried in 1875, so it was my custom when I saw things like this to say, well, look at the piece in the V&A, they're sort of in the 1860s or 1870s, but here we are, and it's received in 1815. So for us China boffins, it's extremely interesting, the early date of these rather hideous vases. And famille noire, again, which increased in fashion and in price through the course of the 19th century, and it reached a peak at the eve of the First World War. And here are two famille noire vases mounted up again. I see it says German or English. I haven't the faintest idea about mounts, so you know. And don't you like this? This was in the saloon at the Royal Pavilion, Brighton. Now, I have to say, again, for a China person, these mounted porcelains to me are an abomination. They're ruining perfectly nice vases, but I know that other people have different views on that. And he also, George IV, acquired Japanese things. This is quite standard Japanese late 17th century export ware, but it was still knocking around on the market and people still like to collect it. And that's how it stands. That's how it was kind of gussied up to be part of the royal collection at that time. Now, moving further on into the 19th century, I can't tell you that dear Queen Victoria was a great fan of Chinese and Japanese things, but she did receive a number through very interesting routes. And they're located both in Buckingham Palace and in Windsor Castle. And I just have to add a note. I was very excited to find that, you know, the balcony where they stand to sort of wave when there are weddings and things, just behind that you step into a salon which is the most amazing chinoiserie fancy, filled with Chinese vases and Japanese pieces and pieces imported from the Brighton Pavilion, and wonderful ceiling decoration. So that room is a great chinoiserie chamber, and the whole of the long corridor which runs down the front of Buckingham Palace is filled with large pieces of Chinese porcelain on stands and all kinds of other interesting things in cases. So that quite excited me when I first saw it. And Windsor Castle, likewise, in the staterooms, I was fortunate enough to go there last November, and I gave a lecture on some pieces. And then at 4 o'clock, the doors of Windsor Castle closed and the public were ushered out, and we were allowed into the staterooms. And we walked through rooms full of Van Dyck pictures and Rubens. I mean, it was just amazing. But when we got to the end, there were some of the prized Chinese pieces, and I was allowed to step over the red rope and pick them up and look at them. So again, that was just terrific. You know, it's really brings the collection to life. And so I'm talking about Queen Victoria here, sorry. What did Queen Victoria own? Well, paradoxically, the oldest piece of Chinese porcelain in the collection has her mark on it, Victoria Regina up here. And it's a piece that dates to the Jiajing period, which is the mid-16th century. Now, I would love to think that that had belonged to Elizabeth I, but there's absolutely nothing linking it with that monarch. So how and why it came to be in the royal collections, we don't know. And she was given other things. This wonderful Jade piece was given to her by the Prime Minister of Nepal. And it's a wonderful jade ruyi. It's a long scepter which the Chinese emperors liked to give as a bestowal of favours. If you were given one of these things, you knew that you had really done well. They have absolutely no function, I have to tell you, but you kind of held them, and it was a jolly nice thing to have. And this is solid jade, very good quality, and it still has the original tassel attached to it. So that's very nice. And it's interesting that it came via Nepal, because there was, of course, a great interchange between Nepal, northern India and China in jade working. If you think of Mughal jade, there was great interest in jade in that part of the world. And much more to Queen Victoria's heart was dear Luti, who was presented after the Second Opium War in 1861. This little Pekingese dog, which this breed became all the rage. And just in the background there, you can see the Japanese Kakyemon vase, or Kakyemon style vase, again dating to the 17th century, but still in the collection and acting as, perhaps it was chosen as a foil for this favourite dog. Now, late in her reign, some very interesting objects come into the royal collection made as diplomatic gifts. So this vase here was actually given by the Emperor of China, who would be the unfortunate Emperor Guangxu, who was the last but one emperor of China who was completely under his mother's thumb. His mother was the Dowager Empress Cixi, who you may have heard of. She was the Dragon Empress. She outlived her husband. She got rid of numbers of people who were kind of in the way, and she completely ruled the roost. So this rather, what can I say about it? Yes, ugly vase, yes, very decorative vase, thank you, Anthony, was given in 1887 and was probably just about brand new then. And again, that's very interesting to us when we're thinking about 19th century porcelain. And here is a photograph of a display of some of the gifts that were given for the Golden Jubilee on the Grand Staircase. None of them look particularly distinguished, I have to say, from the point of view of a scholar. And this was given on the occasion of the Diamond Jubilee in 1897 by the Empress Dowager Cixi, the Dragon Lady herself, and it's a piece of her own calligraphy. She liked to do her own calligraphy and to give it as gifts, and it says glory and honour, and whether she was meaning herself or Queen Victoria, I'm not quite sure, but there we are. And these were given again by the unfortunate Guangxu Emperor on the Diamond Jubilee. And these are much better gifts, actually, if you're interested in the subject, because these are two imperial porcelain blue and white pieces, one of which dates to the Qianlong reign in the 18th century and one to the Daoguang reign in the early 19th century. And these are extremely fine imperial blue and white pieces. And the Japanese also gave gifts. This is a gift by the Emperor of Japan for the Diamond Jubilee. And it's interesting that the Chinese at this point were giving new gifts, but they were also giving old things, probably pulled out of the palace storerooms. What on earth shall we give that woman halfway around the world, you know? So they were pulling out old pieces. But the Japanese chose to give good examples of contemporary craft, the best of their manufacture, and that's what you're looking at here. Now, the 20th century. I've put in many of our rulers from that century, and again, it's a mixed story about how things were acquired. So, if we look at this was presented on the occasion of the coronation of King George V in 1911, and this was given by the pathetic last boy emperor of China, Pu Yi. Have any of you seen the film, The Last Emperor, you know, where the little boy is put on the throne? And this was his gift in 1911, and I have to say that it marks an absolute nadir in Chinese history. You know, they're at the part of their weakest point, and the gift shows that. It's a really substandard piece of cloisonné enamel, contemporary, but on the base it's got a mark of the Qianlong Emperor who ruled in the 18th century, and that was the golden age. So you were saying that this was the great age of Chinese handicrafts, of artworks, but you know, what a sad thing really if you read the story behind this really sort of substandard gift. Now we move on to Queen Mary, who was the wife of King George V, and Queen Mary was, as I'm sure you know, a great collector. She collected lots and lots of things, including lots of Chinese things, and some of the most interesting pieces in the royal collection came in via Queen Mary. She was quite educated about her collection. She collected all sorts of things. Her jades were written about, they were published, and she was part of that great interest in Britain in the early 20th century and between the two wars, when connoisseurs and scholars started to become interested in the early history of China and in early materials. So she was part of that group of people who were interested in this subject. And so, for example, this is a rather wonderful box and cover. Longqing is a very short reign, 1567 to 1572, and it's very rare to have blue and white porcelain from that reign, so it's a very nice thing. And Queen Mary and King George were often given gifts of Chinese things because people knew they liked them, and this was given for the Palace of Holyrood House in 1917. And there's Holyrood House looking rather dour up in Scotland, but had some beautiful Chinese things in it. And the oldest thing in the royal collection this Shang dynasty bronze dating to about 1100 BC, I should say BCE these days, shouldn't I, but BC. And this was presented to Queen Mary by one of her ladies-in-waiting, Lady Dering, in 1933. So one way we've been hearing over the 2 days about how to make your kings and emperors feel good by appropriate gifts, and this still went on in the 20th century. People knew that Queen Mary liked Chinese things and they gave her things. And this, which Junwei bowl, Yuan dynasty, classic taste of the collectors in that period between the two wars. This actually came from the collection of George Eumorphopoulos, who was a Greek shipping magnate who lost his enormous fortune after the crash of 1929, and his huge collection of early Chinese antiquities were jointly purchased by the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum. So both museums have got a lot of George Eumorphopoulos pieces in them, but a few of them slipped away around the side and made their way into the dealers. And this is just one such bowl. And when we're talking about dealers, I should just mention to you the inventory of the London firm of John Sparks Limited. John Sparks went bust finally in, was it 91? Anyway, beginning of the 90s. And I was instrumental in acquiring the inventory books. They had been put up for sale at Sotheby's and nobody bought them. So I said, goodness me, we must acquire these for the Percival David Foundation to go in the library. They're a fantastic resource. And they're still there. They're being conserved at the moment because they have red rot in their leather binding. But the thing about the inventory books is they're very, because John Sparks was one of the premier London dealers. You know, he sold to everybody who was anybody. And I was immensely interested to see that one of the busiest years for business was 1944. Would you believe that? In the middle of the Second World War. It was almost the busiest year. And one of the most frequent patrons was Queen Mary. Queen Mary collected jades, these two lovely little handling pieces, and her jade collection was written about, was published, and she lent things to exhibition. She was very keen to lend things and to act as patron of activities. And this wonderful 18th century, probably, maybe early 19th century, green jade casket, again, a very different taste, but a highly accomplished object. And this, which I think is rather charming, this was a Christmas gift from King George V to Queen Mary in Christmas 1921. And this is actually a jadeite bowl and cover. Now, I'm not giving a lecture on jade, but nephrite jade is the kind of dark green jade, and jadeite jade is bright green and bright white, and it's the jade that became very fashionable. And, you know, when ladies in Hong Kong buy pairs of earrings that cost millions of dollars, those are made of jadeite jade, that bright, bright apple green. So this is actually a little jadeite cup and cover. And another of our 20th century monarchs, the Prince of Wales, who later briefly became King Edward VIII. And this was in one of his tours in Asia when he was doing his royal business. And the Japanese, again, chose to present contemporary examples of their best craftsmanship. So these are from Satsuma, very wonderful Japanese ceramic, and the mark reads carefully made by Keida at Satsuma in Japan, and it has the mark of the maker. So again, you have this division in styles of acquisition. And I'll finish with this image. This was one of many diplomatic gifts given to Her Majesty the Queen. It is in an 18th century style, and it has, again, on the bottom, the mark of the Emperor Qianlong, who you've heard quite a lot about. But the interesting thing about these vases is that they are copies. I won't say they're fakes because that would be too rude, but they are actually, they were made more recently than the 18th century. So it makes quite a nice bookend between poor old George Macartney in Beijing and Qianlong giving him the royal disdain. And I don't know exactly on what occasion this gift was made, but what does it say when you give a foreign monarch a piece which is a reproduction? So these are just a few pieces from the royal collection. It's a very interesting history. It's backed up by all this documentary evidence. And if you feel an interest in it, I do urge you to read John Ayres's books. Thank you.